He was a big figure when I was a kid. Hank Aaron died today.
Yes, he was great.
He was quite a significant character. I'd like to acknowledge that where I'm sitting is the unceded territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt people. And I want to add that where I was born and raised was the ancestral territory of Cree and Ojibwe people. And one of those Ojibwe people was a 4-year-old boy called Curtis Johnny, who came to live in my hometown. It was part of what people now call the 60s scoop, except that happened in the 50s. So it was a 50s scoop. And he was there for about 6 or 7 years in Steinbach, and then was gone. And there's a lot of story to tell about him in those years he was gone. At any rate, he changed his name to his grandfather's name and became Shingoose. And Shingoose was a singer-songwriter, really excellent one, friend of Norvell Morrisseau. He died about a week ago of COVID. And so I just want to dedicate this reading to Shingoose. By the way, my friend Peter Feniak wrote a lovely tribute to him in the Globe and Mail yesterday, if anyone wants to learn more about Shingoose. I'm going to read from this new selected called Outlasting the Weather. My daughter did the cover, which I'm very happy with. She does most of my covers. And it's from Anvil, and I'll put a little plug in for them. They asked me to remind people that they have an isolation discount of 30% on all titles on their website. So that's it for advertising. I'm going to begin with a poem relating to my hometown, Steinbach in southern Manitoba. And it's about an old man who used to walk around on gravel roads wearing a trench coat, gathering stones. And as a kid, I was intrigued by him because sometimes he would lick them. And he'd keep some, and he'd throw some away. He'd fill his pockets with stones. And so over the years, I did a lot of speculation with who he was. I happened with my friend Ralph Friesen to see him die. He was walking across the street in front of us, and he wheeled around and fell flat on his back and died of a heart attack or a stroke, I don't know. The man who licked stones. The man in the long coat licked stones, memorizing the earth's first fire on his tongue. He didn't have time to speak, though he had nothing else. He hadn't come to words. His slow hands hung from the stillness of his torn sleeves, reaching only to touch what he might remember. With his hands, he carefully brushed dust from stones. With his tongue, revealed their rose or cobalt blue. He walked outside town on gravel roads. He walked outside love, too close to worship to say. Around him, earth's rubble and striation, sign and witness of the forge he longed to find. His mouth craving volcanoes, the taste of ash and rain. His mouth ground stones in his sleep. I thought he would vanish one day, spellbound in his cellar among the coal and roots. I thought in the end he might walk into the river with his heavy pockets, but there was no such privilege for him. With the years, I forgot him, or he became a shape I couldn't see wandering around town. I don't know if he took form again, or if it was time for me to see, but I saw him emerge like a photograph in its bath. He was walking past the church. He reeled suddenly with a stiff-legged pivot and fell straight on his back. No one falls like that, the body in surrender to gravity. No one falls as if nothing matters, and nothing did. His eyes glistening like wet sapphires in snow. His dead eyes looked through us, seeing their way into stone.
Beautiful.
I grew up with music. Music is at the root of my existence, and therefore also my poetry. First of all, the mother who sang around the house constantly. She had a beautiful soprano voice, and she played piano as well. And she would, when I was a kid, she'd play me to sleep. I distinctly remember the song by Robert Schumann called Träumerei. But the fulcrum for me was when I found rock and roll, and everything changed for me. I mean, when I first heard Little Richard, I mean, that was demonic. and I loved it. It represented freedom. And it was an interesting, I didn't catch this at first, an interesting weaving of kind of charismatic religion and rock. Little Richard himself quit for a few years and became a preacher. Jerry Lee Lewis's cousin is Jimmy Swaggart. So there was that southern combination of rock and roll and the sacred and the profane existed in the best of rock and roll. The poem I'm going to read is called Glossolalia at the Star Club. A couple of things to explain. Escudito was a singer in the 50s who achieved no success, but who had an influence on Little Richard, especially in his pompadour that he grew and in his flamboyance. Sister Rosetta Tharpe was an incredibly important forerunner of rock and roll and blues. People like Eric Clapton went out of their way in the early 60s when she toured England to go and see her. And Little Richard briefly played with her, and she fused gospel music with rock as well. So that was going on with her too. So she's mentioned here. And it opens with the German words, Die große Freiheit, which was the name of the street in Hamburg where the Star Club was. And the Star Club is where the Beatles played before they were famous. And Little Richard played there too. Die große Freiheit means the great freedom. Die große Freiheit, the naked street where everything passes, where there are no souvenirs, but clowns, cons, and evangelists, dealing in mockery and farce. And the band on adrenaline, bailing out of time, trying to locate Little Richard, hammering triplets like Escudita with his pompadour. No need but the full breath of release. And the singer testifying in tongues, sliding along the edge of the demonic and tearing his shirt like a man possessed by jubilation, shredding words with slippery menace, a Pentecost of a god dancing like lava from Earth's furnace and spilling over the horizon. And Sister Rosetta, didn't the boy find peril in the ecstatic?
Great.
Snuffling like an old man clearing his throat. And then again, and the clink of iron, a deep sigh, and then silence. A thump and an impatient snort. I put down my book and walked to the other room. Of course, there's a horse in the apartment. It's strange how I keep forgetting. This horse has always been around. I used to think one of my grandfathers, but they were brown and black. And I go to the storage room for oats. As it eats, I brush and curry its flank. I don't know how far I can go into its eye, though I know its sudden power. What would I do without it? The way it sweats and shines in July light, or disappears when it plunges through the snowdrifts. It's always been there, waiting for me. And I've ridden it sometimes, riding through world and sun. Memory goes very deep, the memory I can't even recall. But there's always the problem of horse shit in the apartment. There's always that beauty. A poem coming out of my interest in fado, which is a Portuguese form of music, somewhat related to canto hondo in Spain. I've always been in love with its darkness and its dark imagery. And I spent a month trying to find all the live fado I could in Lisbon. And I'll just read one poem coming out of that time. A dark boat. There is a famous fado song called Barco Negra, which means a dark boat. You are alone, and you mean precisely that. Half lit by the lamp, you have nothing. On the wall, a poster of a fadista you once heard, long-legged in her longing, waitress in a three-table cafe. So far to go from a nursing mother to death. The world is quiet outside, though I know it's writhing. You can't speak about the world. Fadista sang of a dark boat. You make do with the night you have. Um, an under-acknowledged poet from Winnipeg, Patrick O'Connell. He died about 15 years ago. He had a rough time of it. His chemicals didn't balance out in his brain. And so he'd be homeless sometimes in the winter, and people would find him and take care of him and so on. But he wrote beautiful, compact, evocative little poems. And I'm going to read a poem I wrote about him. But first, I'd like to give you a sample of what he wrote. Shortly before he died, he came up with a pamphlet called Repertoire for Beggars. And I'll just read the last page. It's very brief. It's kind of a good closing poem for Patrick. Because I've had a sparrow's trust, I have endured it all. With my wishbones for stumbling saints, my repertoire for beggars. And now that the clapperless bell has rung, it is time to follow the bee. For more things fall from heaven than the rain. So today, as I go through Lilac Town, I'll salute the sun and let the cricket in my mandolin have its own say. Patrick told me once, I used to visit him about once a week in his apartment, and every time I'd walk in, he'd haul out his guitar, his Stella guitar, which I think is a really cheap guitar, and he would have put one of his poems to music. And he wasn't a great musician or singer, but it was always nice to hear him take the time to do that. He told me about the first poem he ever wrote, and I think he was around 40 years old by then, late 30s at any rate. Singing he was, O'Connell, leaping from the bath and dancing naked in the kitchen to work out his first poem and the last, at the table among the crumbs and stains. This happens once only, him finding a sound, his sounding, a pool of water at his feet, singing like a frog all night, a bearing for the lost, for himself in his wiles. His song of divine murder, the beggar's bruise. He did sing it in Winnipeg, gruff in his throat, afraid and thirsty, infinity closing in, running fingers through his bristling hair. I can sleep, he said, and he slept. As you might be able to tell from that first poem, but the man licking stones and finding his way to the volcano at the core of the earth, I've long been intrigued by our origins. I don't mean 200, 500,000, 2,000 years ago, prehistory, what we come from, where our violence started. It's a kind of anthropology and archaeology I've been conducting on my own. And I'm going to read a few poems that relate to that. Outside my window here during the day, I love to watch, I've got a lot of gulls around, crows and herons. And this poem is about a heron. And there's one word in there that alludes to one of the most beautiful poems in English language, Dylan Thomas's poem in October. It's called Pterodactyl. Pterodactyl glides across the water with leathery wings, long legs lowering as it nears the shore. And I'm waking, confused, coming awake to being human, the species. How does it work? This sapiens, this brain, these hands trembling slightly with age, the body. What is meant by this blessed body? Confused by the species. Where are the borderlines between salmon and sapiens, hawk and human? The heron standing still in the shallows, priested, yes, then snaky as it uncoils, then stalking on stick legs into prehistory, looking for momentary flashes of light just beneath the surface, stabbing swiftly into the shimmer of a fish, a brief life. And it begins to come back to me, the necessary earth. It comes back, my tongue-tied non-existence. The heron rising, legs dangling for a long moment, a gaunt ghost of extinction, a million years of it, and me, word-spawned bait. a distant grumble of thunder, the kind that arrives slowly, and the child slipping out of the bedroom window, a boy in peril, standing inert in the ozone smell of the approaching storm, a boy holding the fear of beasts, of owls and demons. His eyes never having been lost in such darkness before, trying to be still, deepening his breath. A far-off flash inside a cloud, boiling in the night sky for a moment, seraphic. The boy hearing his blood like thunder from another time. He raises his hands to his face. They're monkey hands. He can see that. Him knowing suddenly the darkness inside, what he is, the earth of himself, his skin a thin border. And he's boy and chimp. He's an unborn thing always being born. And there's a noise in the hedge, something alive. The boy grabbing a low branch and climbing a tree, hugging the trunk high up, that home where there are no stories to make him human. Valentine's Day itch. Guttural cawing from the crow-littered roof, them dropping clamshells, and me tossing chunks of baguette. They glide down, and half a dozen become 2 dozen in seconds, waddling around me. Is that love? Their bright eyes on this host, as they've been on all the ghosts of us, walking pale along streets we've built, language and coins and desire, all that detritus of the made world, and that itch, that Valentine's Day itch to keep the species going. Though by now we've replaced it with chocolates and roses, and we blame it on Mallory and the Knights of the Round Table, that ancient romance. Always some holy grail in the rearview mirror, and them clamshells clattering on the roof. I do have an ongoing war with gulls. A poem called Gulled. What the sea brings forth, we shall eat, sang a choir of gulls. It sounded almost biblical, Elizabethan. Them wheeling high and then plummeting to graze shoaling fish, squabbling and screaming, graceful turns and sudden lifts with an eye for death. Them singing in tongues, and their gray and white vestments just back from the cleaners, and gathering again for a moment before scattering out to sea or inland or overhead. And what passes through us shall descend upon your streets and your heads, they scattered. Absolutely the King James Version. I'll read a last prose poem. In it, there's a Dutch gardener, I forget his name, but there's a documentary on him. He's a famous gardener who works all over the world, I think, making gardens. My father is in it. He loved a garden the way a good Mennonite man of his era did to produce vegetables, but he had a special love of gladiolas. And John Moriarty appears. John Moriarty was a charismatic teacher at the University of Manitoba. I was there, I was 20, he was probably 28, young guy. He had the hair, you remember Bob Dylan on Blonde on Blonde? That head of curly hair. And he was absolutely mesmerizing. I would sit in his class, whether I had that class or not. I would sit in, especially when he talked with James Joyce, Portrait of the Artist. And he had a capacity to go anywhere and always return to the point of the lecture. So I loved this man's classes. He moved away, he got tired of teaching, became a gardener at a monastery in England, and ended up in Ireland, became kind of a popular poet philosopher on Ireland's version of CBC. And I used to listen in to his interviews. And in one of his last interviews, he was taking chemo at the hospital, he was dying. And he mentioned that his hair was all falling out. But what he did with it is he took it home and he placed it at the back of the garden so the birds could build nests. If anyone's interested in learning anything more about this guy, you can find him on YouTube, John Moriarty. You can find 2-hour lectures, but there's a wonderful interview about 12 minutes long with a guy called Tommy Tiernan. If you just type in Tommy Tiernan and John Moriarty, you'll find out who this guy is. Anyway, so he's in this poem called Gardener. The lank-haired Dutch gardener speaks of beauty, but it's only a word, he says, a meager word. The garden is a promise. He scythes long grass in October, measuring another season. Brown is a color too, he says, and gray. My father grew vegetables for the family, but he loved his glads more. He had no words, keeping loose sepia photographs of dead relatives in open black coffins at the back of the family photo album, hidden away and waiting resurrection. The Dutch gardener is on his knees. He wants to build a wildness into his garden, but architecture fails him again and again. Moriarty used to talk about wildness, its necessity, how he hoped to walk backwards across China before he died. He was a gardener as well, shaping language with his secateurs and soil knife. And then, one day, abandoning the garden, he left his hair behind for bird nests. I'll just read one more. Yes, that is me walking up the stairs. How beautiful she is in her sleep. One leg uncovered in the summer heat, her face astonishingly innocent. That is someone else going down the stairs, and someone else again wandering at the back door to stand in the night. And history changes. I can hear it, like wings fluttering, plowshares and belligerents, nations. And that is me climbing the stairs, or someone like me, someone almost in the same story. She is so beautiful in her vast sleep, her leg tucked in now, her face turned the other way. There are thefts and lies and hunger in the homeless city. Languages crumble. The stories are all shifting, negotiations breaking off. I can sleep in this burning house. Thanks.
Wow.
Wow.
Thank you.